Welcome back to our series about exploring the meaning of Christian identity by exploring the sojourning history of Israel. In the last section, we looked at the relationship between the early Israelites and the Canaanites, as well as the story of Joseph's experiences as a slave in Habiru in Egypt. In this section, we will look at the historical context of Israel's sojourn and oppression in Egypt to give us a better understanding of the events that led up to the Exodus and how Moses then developed his theological understanding of God and the mission of God's people. So when the Israelites would have come into Egypt, in the land of Goshen, the land that they settled in, the area that they came to was already known as a region full of Canaanite immigrants. In fact, they would have been one more family among many. The scholar and archaeologist James Hoffmeyer observes that already during the 1800 to 1700s BC that there was a large Canaanite Egyptian presence in the land of Goshen, which was a time that preceded the time of Joseph. According to the archaeological evidence, we can see that the domestic and religious architecture, burial traditions, ceramics, and bronzes all show strong connections to the Levant, although there was an increased Egyptianization of the pottery as time went on. Considering the earliest Asiatic settlement, stratum H and D2 of the Middle Bronze 2A period, Beta concludes donkey sacrifices in connection with tombs and bronzes from the tombs reveal, however, in combination with the house types, that the inhabitants of this settlement were Canaanites, however highly Egyptianized. So what this means is that during the Middle Bronze Age 2A period, we see archaeological evidence based on the ceramics, the houses, these things of material culture that show a connection to the land of Canaan, which meant that the people who left these artifacts behind were Canaanites of origin who were living in Egypt at the time. And we see that they were a rather large population of the Delta region, the eastern Delta region during this time, which shows that that Goshen was a rather popular destination for Canaanites to immigrate to. And these Canaanite Egyptians apparently predated the Hyksos period, which was a time in which Canaanites formally conquered and ruled the land of Lower Egypt. Even after the Hyksos were expelled, there still remained a Canaanite Egyptian presence, which suggests that during ancient expulsions, only the political and military elite actually left. Most of the common people actually remained, which is an important detail when we look at Israel's conquest of Canaan later. If the biblical narratives from Abraham to Joseph are to be synchronized with any period of secular history, then according to Hoffmeyer, they seem to fill in a period covering the 19th through mid-16th centuries. This horizon coincides with the period from the end of the Middle Kingdom and into the Second Intermediate Period, circa 1786 to 1550 BC, when Egypt was for a second time visited by immigrating Semitic-speaking peoples who occupied the eastern delta. From 1800 to 1540 BC, Egypt was an attractive place for the Semitic-speaking people of Western Asia to migrate. Culturally speaking, these Canaanites did not become fully Egyptianized, but developed a hybrid culture that blended elements of both spheres. An example was burial practices. Contrary to the practices of Egyptian elites, they retained the practice of group family burial, in which the bodies of family members were all buried in the same chamber of the tomb. A discovered example was the Aparel family, which not only bore Semitic names, but also followed the late Bronze Age Canaanite tradition of family burials, while adopting many Egyptian funerary practices. Interestingly enough, we actually see Joseph do this very thing in Genesis by having his father Jacob mummified according to Egyptian tradition but buried in Canaan with his wife and forebearers, per Canaanite tradition of family burial. Thus, Joseph may have led his brothers into immediate hybridization, which the brothers did not seem to object to, which is probably due to their own multicultural attitudes as mentioned before in the previous section. Indeed, Jacob himself seemed to have no problem with Joseph's cultural hybridity. This is important because contrary to Abraham's and Isaac's cultural conservatism, remember how they wanted to preserve their cultural heritage by having their children marry women from their old countries, Jacob, by contrast, shows no issue with his sons' interethnic marriages, blessing in particular Joseph's half-Egyptian children as his fully accepted and beloved grandchildren. This would therefore confirm Jacob's own positive attitudes towards hybridity, since he himself first chose, with his brother Esau, to begin identifying with the people of his adopted native-born land and not just the people of his ancestral land. Jacob continues again to show his progressive attitudes concerning tradition by blessing the younger brother over the older one, which you can read in Genesis 49:17-20, and reflection of his own traditional bending ways during his youth, when he himself first swindled his older brother and left home to be an immigrant. We can therefore conclude that the early Israelites were very much developing in a multicultural direction, as they would now incorporate Egyptian elements into their diasporic hybrid Canaanite community. Because immigrants tend to seek out other members of their diaspora, it would have been likely that the Israelites would have settled and lived among other Canaanites that moved to the eastern delta in Goshen. A possible side effect of this may have been their participation in Canaanite Egyptian religion. In fact, the Bible has always mentioned how the Israelites as a whole were never strictly monotheistic until after the Babylonian exile. Israel's rotation with other gods has indeed been a key plot device that drove much of the conflict that existed between God and God's people. When Moses left them, the Israelites, to ascend Mount Sinai, the Israelites immediately reverted back to the Baal worship that they would have been accustomed to in Egypt. This was expressed through their creating the golden calf, since the scholar and Egyptologist Richard Wilkinson tells us that Baal's cult animal was the bull, symbolizing his power and fertility. And in Near Eastern art, he is frequently depicted standing on the back of a bull. This is why the Canaanite culture of the Israelites should not be downplayed, because recognizing it only helps in explaining and understanding how they saw the world and what the biblical struggle between God and Baal was really about. In Egypt, Baal was synchronized with the Egyptian god Seth, so that among Canaanite Egyptians, Seth became their prime god of worship. This is because the two gods were perceived as possessing similar attributes, which caused worshippers to reinterpret them in a manner that reflected their own cultural hybridization. Wilkinson writes, in the Hyksos period, Seth was identified by the foreign rulers with their own god Baal, and rose to great importance as their chief deity. Among the Egyptians, Seth was associated with storms and bad weather of all types, and was also thought to be the god of the wide, raging sea. Mythologically, he could be identified with other malignant deities, including the great chaos serpent Apophis, and he was identified by the Greeks with their own rebellious god Typhon. It should be noted that the Bible associates the sea, storms, and the serpent with malevolence and chaos, which were all associated with Seth, according to Egyptian mythology. Likewise, among the Canaanites, Baal was the West Semitic storm god. The Hebrew Bible records the ancient Israelites apostatizing interaction with this god, and late Bronze Age texts found at Ras Shamra, the ancient Ugarit, on the Levantine coast show that by 1400 BC, Baal had displaced El to become the most prominent deity in the local pantheon. Believed to be active in storms, he was known as Rider of the Clouds and Lord of Heaven and Earth. He also controlled fertility. His bellicose nature as god of storms meant that he was naturally equated with the Egyptian god Seth, and Ramses II himself was said to appear at the Battle of Kadesh like Seth and Baal himself. Thus, both gods were associated with storms and so were synchronized in Egypt, hybridized so as to combine their attributes. In fact, it is the attributes of the Canaanite Egyptian Baal Seth that seem to function as a foil to everything that the Hebrew God stands for. As a god of chaos, which is symbolized by his power over storms, Seth was seen as a malevolent figure among the Egyptians, and consequently among the Hebrews, which is why Baal began to be viewed in a negative light within the Bible, since to the Hebrews, Baal and Seth became one and the same. Indeed, among the Egyptians, Seth was the Red One, the ill-tempered god who personified anger, rage, and violence, and who was often regarded as evil personified. As the god of chaos, he opposed the harmony of Ma'at, which means truth, and was a veritable dark side to the fabric of the universe. As a god of the desert or red land, he opposed and threatened the vegetation upon which life itself depended, and was the inimical foe of Osiris, rightful king of Egypt. He represented rebellion and strife. Thus, God's struggle against Baal was not just a matter of monotheism against polytheism, but was actually a deeper ideological struggle of good and evil within Israel's symbolic world. But why would people choose to worship a god of chaos? It is because Seth's violent nature was seen as a means of strength and military power. The character of Seth was not entirely inimical, however, as he was also held to be cunning and of great strength, and these qualities could be put to good use. One of his most common epithets was great of strength. The warrior Tutmosis III called himself beloved of Seth, for example. And Ramses II is said to have fought like Seth at the Battle of Kadesh. Additionally, just as Baal was associated with power and fertility, Seth was associated with aggressive sexual power. And while Baal displaced El, which the Bible seems to equate with God as being the main god of the Canaanites, Seth was too associated with the strength of kingship. Thus, their myths in Egypt became intertwined, so that both were attributed as doing the same things. For example, both were mythically accredited with vanquishing the sea god Yam and being married to the goddesses Anat or Astarte. So, when Israel became oppressed by Pharaoh, it is possible that Pharaoh himself represented the evil works of Baal/Seth, since in the 19th and 20th dynasties, the god was elevated as a kind of patron deity of the Ramesside kings, some of whom bore his name, for example Sethos, which means man of Seth, and Sethnachte, which means Seth is mighty, which could add a deeper meaning if the pharaoh of the Exodus was indeed Ramesses II or someone from his dynasty. Interestingly, when the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty retook Lower Egypt from the Hyksos, the war was depicted as a struggle of liberation against ardent Seth worshippers. Mark van der Meerhoop writes, Hyksos religion becomes an issue in the story of Apepi and Seqenenrata. The tale states that Apepi honored no god besides Seth and worshipped him as if he was Ra. The conflict between Thebes and Avaris was thus framed in terms of the city's cults, and the event became a religious clash between the Egyptian and the foreign. While the Hyksos were depicted as being worshippers of Seth, the Egyptians of Upper Egypt in Thebes began to follow the god Amun, who was synchronized with Ra, to create Amun-Ra king of the gods. But what is interesting about the struggle is that it in some ways anticipates the conflict of the Exodus, which was also framed as a struggle for liberation. This is because Amun was depicted as a god of justice, the antithesis of Seth's violent chaos. According to scholar and Egyptologist Donald Rutherford, Amun-Ra was concerned with the maintenance of Ma'at, which again means truth, justice, or goodness, not only on the wider scale, but even at the level of the individual. He became the champion of the poor and a focus of personal piety. And again, according to Wilkinson, the god was regarded as an advocate of the common man, being called the vizier of the humble, and he who comes at the voice of the poor. In fact, when one reads a hymn to Amun, the content seems eerily reminiscent to the Hebrew Psalms concerning how the Hebrews saw their God as the champion of the oppressed and abounding in mercy and steadfast love. For example, scholar and Egyptologist John Wilson reports how a father dedicated a hymn of humble gratitude to Amun-Ra, who hears the prayer, who comes at the cry of the poor and the distressed, who gives breath to him who is weak. Thou art Amun, the Lord of the silent man, who comes at the cry of the poor man. If I call to thee when I am distressed, thou comest and rescuest me. Thou givest breath to him who is weak. Thou rescuest him who is imprisoned. Though it may be that the servant is normal in doing wrong, yet the Lord is normal in being merciful. The Lord of Thebes does not spend an entire day angry. As for his anger, in the completion of a moment there is no remnant. As thy Ka endures, thou wilt be merciful, and we shall not repeat that which has been turned away. Clearly, the Egyptians saw themselves as being an oppressed people during the Hyksos period. Half of their country was considered to be under Hyksos occupation. Mirhup notes that because these foreigners held a part of Egypt, modern scholars often call the fight against them a war of liberation, an idea Egyptians themselves promoted. Thus, their devotion to Amun could be understood as being a kind of foreshadowing to Israel's own future response under Egyptian oppression. When the Egyptians did expel the Hyksos in their reconquest of the north, their foreign and domestic policy began to take on a more nationalistic and supremacist flavor. According to Wilson, it was no longer enough to exhibit to foreign countries the superiority of Egyptian culture, and thus to harvest favorable trade. These foreigners were no longer subjects to be patronized for their own good and for the good of Egypt. They had shown themselves to be rebellious. Pharaoh must take the time to teach them effective lessons of discipline in their own lands. Thus, after the reconquest of the north, Egypt sought to never be humiliated by a foreign occupation again, as it embraced a spirit of revanchism. In their minds, the only way to secure their borders was to subdue their neighbors through military dominance, using offense as their best defense. The desire for revenge, the triumph of liberation, the lust for loot, and the discovery of power combined to make the period uniquely nationalistic and patriotic. This was not simply Pharaoh's war. Every active citizen of Egypt shared in this common enterprise. For the Egyptians, all Canaanites were now the enemy. They were not interested in recognizing regional variance. All of them were considered guilty by association. We cannot be sure that the Asiatics, whom they attacked in Palestine and Syria, were demonstrably the same as those who had conquered and humiliated Egypt. But the text gives some indication that the revenge motif lasted for a long time. Thus, Egypt began to launch invasions into Canaan, initially to cause terror. as the Egyptians were not content to drive the Hyksos out of Egypt, but felt compelled to pursue them with a vindictive fury for more than a century. However, Egypt did not plunge directly into the full career of empire building. It took 3 full generations to effect the work of reconstruction after the Hyksos were expelled. The military campaigns into Asia under Ahmose I, Amenhotep I, Tutmosis I and II were in the nature of punitive raids, rather than conquering campaigns. At the same time that Egypt was launching offensives abroad, it was also initially trying to rebuild at home, making Egypt great again, which required labor. Now, a full government for the two lands had to be reinstituted, offices and services reestablished, and the government machinery brought back into play. The civil and religious bureaucracy of Egypt had to be constructed and trained. Most importantly, from the Egyptian point of view, the gods had to be propitiated by buildings and new services. This then is the context that should be understood when we read the beginning of Exodus in verses 1:8 to 14. We read that the reason that the Israelites became oppressed was because a new regime came into power that was unconnected to the Joseph-related regime. And so it can be identified with the 18th dynasty, who drove out the Canaanite-descended Hyksos regime. And so in our next section, we will learn about the story of Moses and how God inspired him through his cultural hybridity to see the world in a wholly new and different way, so as to restructure how we understand justice and what it means to serve God and cosmic harmony.